I need the people to understand that if they don't fucking stand up right now and these capitalists, maybe beep that. Hey, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Left Unread. I'm one of your hosts, Will.
I'm the other host. My name is Aaron. We are two dudes engaged in radical self-education.
We're just two potential new commissars in the People's Department of potential new People's Departments. And
we have read...
That's right.
Labor in Irish History by James Connolly. That's labor with a U, just to be clear.
Labour. Yes, James Connolly, most well known for his involvement in the 1916 Irish Rising and as an icon during the birth of an independent Ireland, James Connolly was a fierce proponent for working man's power. Born to two Irish famine refugees in Scotland, he advocated for total economic liberty for the Irish as well as all of the proletarian class through the execution of organized class warfare from Europe to the United States. His life's work around the world in proclamation of an independent Ireland owned by the Irish earned him execution at the hands of the British.
A gruesome execution.
Yeah, pretty brutal.
And we have read Labor in Irish History, written largely while Connolly lived as an expat in the United States between 1903 and 1910. Labor in Irish History was first published in installments through Connolly's socialist newspaper, The Workers' Republic, before being collected and published in its full form in 1910. A classic in the bibliography not only of Connolly but of European Marxists et al., Labor in Irish History traces Irish history through the lens of historical materialism, bringing to the fore the role of the working class as the central pillar in the political and economic development of Ireland, outlining the symbiosis of the class struggle and the national struggle in Ireland's hard-fought struggle for independence against the British imperialist class. Both a historical account of the power of proletarian organization and a prescient warning against revisionist coalition, Labor in Irish History is rich in lessons from a preeminent Marxist thinker too often overshadowed by the works of his Soviet contemporaries. Or, as one Goodreads reviewer posits, fuck England.
Yeah, fuck England. Yeah, it's something you could definitely see throughout this book is just how fucking brutal England actually is. I mean, that's kind of how he starts this whole thing, is by saying that capitalism is something completely foreign to Ireland.
Yeah.
The first history that he talks about in Ireland really has to do with the fact that under the clan system, he says that they had communal ownership. I mean, it was chieftains that were still, they're still reliant on the sufferance of their people, right? I'm looking at 199. Part of the reason we chose this book was because there is an Irish question in mind. I personally don't have that much knowledge of Ireland outside of the Troubles, and even that is very little.
Same.
This book being, not a full history of Ireland, as Connolly says, but as just kind of a snapshot of history through the lens of labor. I think that was really nice. But I'm looking at 199 because he says, as a preliminary to this essay, it becomes necessary to recapitulate here some salient facts of history we have elsewhere insisted upon as essential to a thorough grasp of the Irish question, right? And so what really is the Irish question there? Well, he says that it may surprise many readers to learn that up to the date above mentioned, 1649, that's when the clan system was broken up forcibly by the English, the basis of society in Ireland, except within the Pale, a small strip of territory around the capital city, rested upon communal or tribal ownership of land. The Irish chief, although recognized in the courts of France, Spain, and Rome as the peers of the reigning princes of Europe, in reality held his position upon the sufferance of his people, and as an administrator of the tribal affairs of his people, while the land or territory of the clan was entirely removed from his private jurisdiction. So we're talking about the transition in Ireland from this kind of, tribal system, this clan system, to feudalism, and it was done through force. It was done through invasion, right? It was done through conquest. And I think that that's something that Connolly holds pretty central.
Yeah, and I think even he continues on the next page to explain that he's not suggesting that if Britain wasn't to come in and force feudalism upon the Irish, that they wouldn't have found their way to a capitalism. As a good historical materialist, he recognizes that, well, I'll just read it. He says, communal ownership of land would undoubtedly have given way to the privately owned system of capitalist landlordism, even if Ireland had remained an independent country. But coming as it did, in obedience to the pressure of armed force from without, instead of by the operation of economic forces within, the change has been bitterly and justly resented by the vast mass of the Irish people, many of whom still mix with their dreams of liberty longings for a return to the ancient system of land tenure, now organically impossible.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good encapsulation of the kind of duality of the struggle that Connolly outlines here, which is the people's struggle is always in Ireland, in Irish history, a national struggle also.
Yeah, it's part of the national question. I mean, a couple of pages back on 197, I mean, he has a really fantastic quote where he says, "In the evolution of civilization, the progress of the fight for national liberty of any subject nation must, perforce, keep pace with the progress of the struggle for liberty of the most subject class in that nation, and that the shifting of economic and political forces which accompanies the development of the system of capitalist society leads inevitably to the increasing conservatism of the non-working class element and to the revolutionary vigor and power of the working class."
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me because so much of the conflict in Ireland, at least as we see it from the outside, is been wrapped up in a sectarian conflict, right? The Catholics versus the Protestants.
Yep.
In some senses, that's just a reflection of Ireland versus England. And I think that one of the most powerful messages throughout the history of Ireland in this book is just the idea that, well, two things really. First, when it comes to that religious conflict, so often it's overshadowed by class conflict. I think that that point comes up again and again and again. And the idea that Connolly's putting forth is that taking the most subject class of that nation, that is really what's going to carry with it the power to have real revolutionary change.
Well, I was quote hunting while you were speaking because I just wanted to comment on the fact that Connolly is very, very aptly recognizes that this seemingly sectarian struggle between Protestants and Catholics is really a manifestation of class warfare.
Yeah.
There are a couple of quotes that kind of point that out. On 224, very quickly he says, "Irish politics and divisions turn primarily around questions of property and only nominally around questions of religion," kind of getting to the heart of that. But he says it more plainly on 239, where he says, "In fact, in Ireland at the time, there were not only two nations divided into Catholics and non-Catholics, but each of those two nations in turn was divided into the other two, the rich and the poor."
Yeah, that page actually has one of my favorite quotes about this, where he says, "The Protestant workman and tenant was learning that the Pope of Rome was a very unreal and shadowy danger compared with the social power of his employer or landlord, and the Catholic tenant was awakening to a perception of the fact that under the new social order, the Catholic landlord represented the mass less than the rent roll." So that conflict, which people hold to be very core in Ireland, is really a lot of times overshadowed by class conflict.
Yeah, or even just maybe I would say mischaracterized as a culture war and not a class war.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it is so wrapped up in history. I mean, even as far back, looking at like page 203, Connolly even says that the Catholics sided with the crown in their historical battles. Like, here he's talking about the Jacobites. Yeah. This was really interesting to me because it's a situation where neither side in this war is beneficial to the Irish. We're talking about the conflict between King James of England and William of Orange. And he says that, it is beyond all question that the Irish Catholics shed their blood like water and wasted their wealth like dirt in an effort to retain King James upon the throne. And the question is why? Why? The reason is not hard to find, James Connolly says. The Catholic gentlemen and nobles who had the leadership of the people of Ireland at the time were one and all men who possessed considerable property in the country, property to which they had, notwithstanding their Catholicity, no more right or title than the merest Cromwellian or Williamite adventurer. So, another example there where the Catholics, right, the Catholic leaders of Ireland sided with ultimately the Protestant crown because they were landholders. It's the devil they knew, even though it's literally their conquerors.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of foundational to this text in my takeaway is the dangers of this kind of revisionist coalition that can happen, to be mindful about siding with folks that are chopping off your legs at the knees kind of thing.
Well, it reminds me of a lot of the discussions we've had about like the Popular Front when we read like Trotsky and Stalin and they talked about in Chinese history, because I think there's just still a lot of debate as to whether that was the correct line maybe in history. Most people will say that in Spain the Popular Front was the cause of their defeat, although I don't know if they had another alternative really.
Yeah.
But it's a very similar criticism to what Connolly is making here, because time and time again you see where the middle classes ultimately, even though they're part of this coalition in the beginning, they ultimately give it up to preserve their own rights. I mean, that's something that is prominent throughout the book, even on page 200, which should be right on. He says, Hence, the spokesmen of the middle class in the press and on the platform have consistently sought the emasculation of the Irish national movement, the distortion of Irish history, and above all, the denial of all relation between the social rights of the Irish toilers and the political rights of the Irish nation. So again, there is no Irish question without also there being a question of class, right, of the working class in Ireland. And he says, it was hoped and intended by this means to create what is termed a real national movement, i.e. a movement in which each class would recognize the rights of other classes and, laying aside their contentions, would unite in a national struggle against a common enemy, England.
Yeah.
So that's that popular front we're talking about, right? These classes would recognize the rights of each other and they'd unite together to fight England. Needless to say, the only class deceived by such phrases was the working class. When questions of class interest are eliminated from public controversy, a victory is thereby gained for the possessing conservative class, whose only hope of security lies in such elimination. It's just something that we ultimately have to recognize, is that so much of this is tied up in class relations, right, in property.
Yeah, and there's an undercurrent here in this first section that I think speaks as a warning against that kind of popular front invading and reshaping the conception of the working class as a whole. It's kind of, I have a lot of quotes that I marked as the, like, kill the oppressor that lives inside your head from this first section. Like, I want to jump back a couple of pages. 194, he's talking here a little bit about culture death, so to speak, and how that develops that thought into demonstrating how that can allow this sort of insidious overtaking to happen, where the popular front is no longer representing the interests of the people that are supposed to be represented by it. I'll just throw out a couple of quotes from 194. He's talking about some rebellions that had occurred in history. He says, "It killed the Gaelic Ireland. An Irish-speaking Catholic was of no value as a missionary of Catholicism in England, and as an Irish peasant who treasured the tongue of his fathers might also have some reverence for the principles of the social polity and the civilization under which his forefathers had lived and prospered for unnumbered years." And then continues later in that paragraph to say their children were taught to despise the language and traditions of their fathers. So that it's that culture death that he says eventually turns Irishmen into people that are born with an apology in their mouth.
Yeah. He does a lot to talk about Irish, quote, patriots. You know, he talks about Irish literature in English. And I think that there's a culture of the oppressed he's kind of talking about that reminds me of, honestly, when we were reading, like, Black Skin, White Masks, you know, the kind of mental state that the oppressed puts itself in because they're literally surrounded by this oppressing culture, even down to their language, right? Even down to their identity. And I think that it really shows itself throughout this book. I'm thinking about later, like, when they say, you know, they're speaking in English to a class of people that speaks Irish. 283, later when he's talking about the Irish Confederation, right? He says, amid such conditions, the Irish Confederation had been preaching the moral righteousness of rebellion and discoursing learnedly in English to a starving people, most of whom knew only Irish, about the historical examples of Holland, Belgium, Poland, and Tyrol. So it just made me think about, you know, meeting the people where they're at. And when it comes to an oppressed people like the people of Ireland, the mass line in that sense really requires, like, literally in this sense, a difference in language. You know, they're talking about communicating in Irish rather than English. You know, in this example, they're literally talking about a different language. But I can also interpret it as this intellectualized thing. It's like how we've had this conversation about dumbing down the message to reach more people.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah, that's where I'm trying to get at here. Because we're talking about meeting the people where they're at and conversing with them. You know, what that entails is understanding that person's position. In this book, it's really evident because they're Irish. They're literally people of a different nationality, or, right, an othered people. But I think that it's important to keep that in mind in a current context as well, because we have to talk to people in a way that they can understand, but it's not necessarily one that's dumbing down their message. Do you know what I'm trying to say there? So I just think that was an interesting historical example, because when he talks about the Irish Confederation there, he talks about, you know, how they had a real chance, how a lot of these struggles had a possibility. I mean, there's moments throughout this history where, like in 1776, when the British Army was off fighting the colonies and the volunteers formed, Connolly is certain that there was an opportunity there, right? Or with the Irish Chartist movement, how they could have inspired the English and French Chartist movements. I don't know. I'm kind of branching off in a bunch of different paths here.
Yeah, I have thoughts on a couple of those branches.
Yeah.
I guess, to the point of, like, meeting the people where they are. The case that Connolly is outlining by literally breaching the language barrier that's there. In a modern context, I've been thinking a lot about since reading Blood in My Eye, thinking a lot about activating the lumpenproletariat and thinking about folks that are, so to speak, on the margins of society that are the most apt for radicalization.
Yeah.
But they're not going to be, in every case, the easiest to communicate a radicalizing message with, because there might be a language barrier, there might be other issues involved, their relationship to the carceral state or their relationship with houselessness or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
There are things like that you have to specifically, it's not that you're changing the message, but form the message in a way that responds to their material state in the same way that, like, literally a language barrier is one of those things.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's kind of a loose association with what you were saying, but I've been thinking about that. And I lost the thread. What was the last thing that you said? Oh, about kind of opportunism.
Yeah.
And seizing on moments that come about.
Well, I have some thoughts about that kind of thing because, even though this is a very history-based book, I couldn't help but think about the current climate while we were inside of it, especially because in the same sense where I'm reading Connolly talking about these eras and these events and saying, like, here's an opportunity, right? Here's a literal crisis happening where if we had been better organized or if we had done certain things, then we could have seized national liberation for Ireland. And I'm just wrangling with that in the current climate because it seems like we are just moving ever closer and closer to large-scale catastrophe. And the fear that I have is that there is not any organization that is strong enough or organized enough or widespread enough or any of these things to avert that collapse from collapsing into complete fascism or to, into 6 fascist super regions that all start warlording with each other or whatever. And so it's just been on my mind a lot because the question is, like, how are people living through all of this without doing anything about it, right? What's going to be the line that gets crossed to make people actually do something? And I think that there's a push and pull between what people are willing to do with the things surrounding them and the kind of organizations that exist to lead or push them to do things. I'm fearful that we don't have that kind of organization here. Part of reading this kind of gives me a lot of Lenin vibes from Connolly. I know that's something that we've kind of briefly discussed, but he is very strongly advocating for a vanguard party, whether he says it explicitly or not. He doesn't, I mean. And I just think that here we are again. It's 2025, and we're looking at what could be a total systemic collapse, and there literally is not an organized structure in place to deal with it from our side.
I feel exactly the same way as you in pretty much every way that you just outlined. I'll start from the top. So reading this, yes, there are so many quotes where I wrote, like, if this isn't salient, you know what I mean? Like, it just feels as though he's talking about our conditions, our situation right now, even though this was written 120 years ago.
Well, the thing is, real quick, I don't want to cut you off too badly because I want you to finish your thought. But the thing is that here we're looking at Irish patriots, quote unquote, as collaborators, right? The difference is that they're collaborating with the English. The English are ultimately the capitalists. And we're dealing with the same thing here. We have the American patriots, right? The Democrats, and they are collaborationists. It's just that they aren't collaborating with an outside force. They're collaborating with an inside force, right? Our capitalists.
Yeah.
It's the same structure.
Well, that makes me want to read this quote from 201, where Connolly writes, "They were all anxious enough for freedom, but realizing the enormous odds against them and being explicitly told by their leaders that they must not expect any change in their condition of social subjection, even if successful, they as a body shrank from the contest and left only the purest minded and most chivalrous of their class to face the odds and glut the vengeance of the tyrant."
Yes.
Tell me that does not sound exactly like the conditions that we are in right now.
Right. Nobody's advocating for real change. They're
Yeah.
saying maybe we can die better.
Yeah. And you can, even looking at that through the lens of any particular single issue, whatever you want to say, and, to take it back to the last presidential election, the options were not genocide or no genocide. The options were genocide or genocide, but we talk about it differently.
Yeah. Or we don't talk about it at all.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
Right.
And then so it's left to the most chivalrous of the class to face the odds.
Yeah.
It just feels very prescient. To the point of them being very much like Lenin, I agree in superficial and not so superficial forms. I will say also, one way that I think Connolly is very similar to Lenin is I think his writing style is quite similar.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say he's quite as cheeky as Lenin.
Yeah,
can
not
get.
as polemical, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, but he does have the same sort of like fire to his prose that I really, really admire.
Yeah.
Where he'll turn a phrase that just gets me all fucking amped up.
Yeah, I did not expect to be excited about Irish history, but it was gripping at least.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. And it's just very, very compelling to read. And to the point of organization in the modern day. I agree with that as well. I think there is a chasm between the organization that is necessary to move us forward from catastrophe and the organization that we have currently, which, as we have said so many times, is ameliorative to the state that we're in and doesn't, at least in our estimation, do enough to actually move people forward in a way that's going to be responsive to the catastrophe that we seem to be on the precipice of.
Yeah.
I do wonder, sort of tangentially, I don't mean to call us revolutionaries because I've aired my problems with that in the past, but
Right.
like if being a revolutionary makes you see the world for what it is, or if being a revolutionary makes you see in the world what you expect. To speak of our current precipice of catastrophe, I do wonder how much of that is the reality, me being a good reader of the situation, acknowledging the material conditions as they are, versus prescribing that onto the conditions. Because it is very fucking weird to be shouting into the abyss about, like, here's the thing that I'm recognizing, and for it to not be corroborated meaningfully. That does make me question it a little bit. But.
There's no justice in I told you so. That's the problem, is that when it all fucking happens, I'm really sick of seeing communist meme online where it's like, communists, the weight of everything, of being correct all the time. And it's like,
Tankies,
okay, that's right, maybe, but also we're dying, like being right isn't stopping us from dying. Like to be right maybe isn't the point at the end of the day, maybe we need to be more than just right.
That feels like a very online thing.
It's true. We are very online as well.
But largely that kind of takes me to thinking about the lessons that I took from this book are broadly to follow this kind of pattern. Number 1, organize the people. Number 2, protect the people. Number 3, coalition into vanguard. To say that more specifically with what Connolly outlines in Labor and Irish History and what I know of Connolly's organizational history as an individual, organizing the people, that starts with trade unions. Protecting the people, that comes from militias being born of protecting the unions because they're under constant duress. And then the coalition, that's where you get your united front that is led by a vanguard party. And I know that that's kind of a broad brush to say, like, organize the people, protect the people, and then build a coalition.
Yeah.
But where's the lie is the point. And so, like, the question of organization in the modern age and that chasm that exists between organization that is necessary to move the people forward in a positive direction and the organization that we have that is largely ameliorative, I do still think like organizing the people around something that is palatable to them is the way to make progress in closing that gap.
Sure.
And that's where I see trade unionism as a mechanism there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's effective because it's palatable for the majority of Americans. It's something that we've seen the decline of in membership, and you can also right on top of that, put the transparency of the graph of the decline in pretty much every metric that's meaningful to workers. But look at the rise in pay for CEOs versus the stagnation or decline in pay for working people, as an example. If we could organize trade unionism effectively to start getting gains for working people, that builds the bridge to larger education and class solidarity that allows all of the other stuff to take place. That's a big lesson for me from this that, again, I know feels like a very face value thing, but the infrastructure already exists or did once exist for trade unionism as the means of organization.
Right. Okay. So I've been thinking about this because I think that largely the trade unionism struggle has been played out in the United States. I think that the infrastructure seems like it's there, but I think that there's a fundamental problem with the trade union struggle, and it's that it's within the legal framework. There are a lot of benefits to the unions as being a place of starting, like you said. They're organizations that already partially exist. They're palatable to people. Another thing is that they're organized around actual production, right? If you are in control of a factory through a union, then you have a factory that can produce something, right? Literal means of production in your control.
Which manifests as potentially means of subsistence after cataclysm.
Yeah, and on top of that, by building the structures of organization for production, we're building structures of organization on a grander scale as well.
Yeah.
We're literally, like as Lenin says or Stalin says, right, we're training the people to then be put into organization of more than just the factory. And so I think that is an interesting thing. Now, the problem I have with trade unionism is that it's not out of nowhere, right? It's not in a vacuum. There is a history of the trade union struggle in America, and it's ended with the trade union's defeat.
Yeah.
We'd essentially, it's not that we're starting from scratch. We're starting in the hole. You know what I mean? We're starting in a framework where unions are already worked against actively. That gets to what I was saying earlier about it being within the legal framework, right? Because if we're trying to just create unions around these factories and things, one, there simply aren't factories like there used to be. There's hardly a factory floor to organize people around. Secondly, we're talking about organizing in large conglomerates, which will very quickly fire a lot of the... I'm thinking about retail in that regard, right? You couldn't unionize like a Best Buy without a large national organization struggle. And it's not that that's impossible. It's just very difficult in the current framework.
Harder, yeah.
And that's not to mention jobs that are nebulous in that sense, right? Gig work. So I think that there are ups and downs to the union, like the factory union specifically, for that kind of organization. What I was thinking about the last time we talked about this is broader senses of that organization, like why limit yourself to a factory? And I think that if you're expanding it out from that part, it gets away from trade unionism as an idea into something that is more generally about like survival programs, right? Separate parallel institutions that will allow for subsistence after calamity.
Yeah, organization in the community that's not centered around production, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think... It's not that trade unions are out of the question, right? I just think that it's part of a larger structure that has to happen. And I think that you're right about a lot of things there. I just think that the struggle for trade unionism in the U.S. has been majorly lost,
I don't know. I mean, I acknowledge that there's baggage with that, but there's unspeakably more baggage around even just the word communism in the United States.
Sure.
And that's I don't think it's a reasonable response to that to advocate for let's just not call it communism, but give them communism. I think that will be overcome once wins start to occur.
Yeah.
I think what you do is you show a trade union being effective, and the effectiveness of that trade union is what's meaningful. I do take your point that American manufacturing is effectively non-existent now, which is where the heart of the trade union movement was built around, specifically the automotive industry.
Yeah.
And that's all been shipped overseas. But that, to me, is an opportunity. That's a boon, not a bane, because it gives you a clear organizing principle that people can get behind, so to speak.
Okay, but here's the thing, and here's where the paths diverge. Showing the unions are effective at what is the thing, right? Because if we're talking about, if they're effective at being unions, that's ameliorative. I mean, if they're effective at just making better conditions for the working class, I don't think that that's necessarily what we're looking for. They need to be effective at driving class consciousness. Mm-hmm. Having an effective union in the sense of what a union is for is not inherently revolutionary. So I think that that's another thing that has to be reckoned with if we're talking about basing our organizing principle on the union struggle. Whereas I think if you're looking at broader organizations, maybe more community-based organizations around survival, I mean, you're still dealing with that problem because you're talking about, ameliorating conditions. But I think that it may be easier to drive class consciousness on a more general principle than necessarily through the scope of a factory.
I don't know. I'm not resolved enough to agree with that yet. I take the point.
Yeah.
I just don't see a case where organizing that education around class consciousness outside of a trade union can be more effective than doing it inside of a trade union. I'm not saying that it's less effective.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure I'm ready to accept that it's more effective.
No, I understand that. Yeah, I think that's a fair argument.
My own personal history with trade unionism in my family, my mother was a Teamster and was, even though she was not the most socially aware politically person, which maybe advocates for your point, she was very strongly and continues to very strongly advocate for trade unionism in general as a means of bolstering the working class, giving them conditions that are more favorable to them. And she will defend to her dying breath the Teamsters and the work that they do to provide things that make the material conditions for workers better.
Sure.
And there's just something of knowing how strongly she feels a connection to that union and how she will be ride or die for it.
Yeah.
I can't break away from that as seeing the revolutionary potential in that.
This is where I'm interested in histories of organizations like the IWW, because
Yeah.
one big union is an interesting concept. I'm interested in that. I think that what I'm saying is that I'm thinking about the coalition, honestly, right? It's that trade unions are part of the coalition, but it's not that they're the leading part. Like, it's not the core principle of organization. I'd rather that be more centered around something like a party, honestly, as it currently stands, I mean.
That's fair.
I think it goes back to that. It's about what the ultimate cause is, right? What the union is effective at.
Yeah.
We're talking about creating class consciousness, right? We want to elevate the working class to feel that they have the ability to abolish the class relation we currently have. That's what revolution is. It's not that we're starting we're not sparking some fire or whatever, but we're creating the conditions for the working class to stand up. And I guess we should say we're aiding in the creation of those conditions. It's not that we're creating those conditions necessarily. Those conditions already exist.
Yeah.
But the recognition of those conditions, that is what is our goal.
Yeah. The acknowledgement of an education around those conditions.
Yeah. I need the people to understand that if they don't fucking stand up right now and these capitalists, maybe beep that, we are going to boil ourselves alive, okay? We need a climate Stalin yesterday.
Well, and I just think, this is going to move us in another direction even, but I am just so fucking, I don't even know how to say it in a way that I want to say on the show. ICE is fucking crazy.
Yeah.
That people are being kidnapped on the streets by masked individuals that we have no identifying information about. So there's absolutely no way that they can legally be held to account at this state.
Yeah.
And we're all just like, yeah, that's happening. Like, what the fuck?
It's brutal. I mean, it's totally disparaging because it's all these historical parallels, man. We're seeing the Gestapo, This is literally the dirty war happening again. I don't know what to tell you. And it makes me think of what you were saying earlier, right? Am I actually seeing the patterns or am I just like driving myself insane?
Yeah.
But, people are actually dying, people are actually being disappeared.
Yeah.
That's not some false recognition here. Like, those things are actually happening. I don't know what it's going to take. Like, are people so afraid of escalation that they are going to let themselves be stomped to death? That's what it seems to be like.
That is a principle around which organization could be formed. That's not a trade union.
Yeah.
That has a clear, defined goal: protect the people from being kidnapped. And you see it happening, especially in Chicago. I feel like you see it where there is community defense happening.
Totally.
Showing that it can be quite effective. We just need more of that.
Yeah.
I guess what more of that, please.
It's just a really tough situation to be in right now.
Yeah.
It's frustrating to see, and I don't know. There's a benefit that the Irish had in their organizing struggle, and that's that they had a nation to organize around. And I think that that's a big question when it comes to America. Is there an American identity that is worth organizing around? Is there an ideal set of American standards that exist outside of capitalism that could be, capitalized on for organization, right? I think that that's such an interesting question because America has no history outside of capitalism. I mean, Native Americans, yes, but...
The United States has no history.
Yes. Yeah. And that's tough, right? We couldn't organize on national liberation in the same sense that the Irish could. We are our own oppressors.
Yeah, the problem is that the only history that the United States has is as the oppressor. And so there's nothing to organize. There's no oppressor to organize against that is in ourselves.
Yeah.
This was a big question for me reading this text. There are a couple of quotes I'll throw out here. I'll start on 259, I guess, at the very end of chapter 10. Connolly asks, "May we not also take pride in the fact that an Irishman was the first to pierce the worse than Egyptian darkness of capitalist barbarism and to point out to the toilers the conditions of their enslavement and to the essential prerequisites of their emancipation?" Really pulling on that national identity, or I'll call it an ethnic identity in this case. He also said further back on 205, talking about Irish resistance to the English. He says, they fought not for the freedom of Ireland, nor for the restitution of their rights to the Irish people, but rather to secure that the class who then enjoyed the privilege of robbing the Irish people should not be compelled to give way in their turn to a fresh horde of land thieves. And both of those quotes, my problem is that we are the land thieves, the United States.
Yeah.
We stole the land. We are not the ones that stood against the oppression. We are the ones that did the oppression. And so our entire history is one of subjugation and oppression against indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans, the terrible conditions under which we held all workers, but especially Chinese workers, Irish workers. Like, it really got me thinking about other revolutionary movements and how there is always a national component to carry along with it as an organizing principle. And, you know, there's a part of me that's always uncomfortable with that. It's a little dyspeptic because nationalism in general is something that I can't abide.
Yeah.
But I do see in it, in the context that Connolly is talking about it, in the way that Connolly is talking about it, it's less a question of nationality and more a question of ethnicity that creates a kind of connective tissue for organizing around that we just don't have.
It's something that I think you have to be cautious about. That's really how I feel.
Yeah.
Are there things in the American ideal that are worth pursuing? The answer is yes. Freedom, justice, equality, liberty, and happiness for all. You know, the pursuit of happiness, all of these things
we pretend to be.
Right, exactly. But that's exactly the problem, right? We need people to understand that real freedom has never been tried, right? Real liberty has never been tried.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's something that still needs to be built. That's the organizing principle. Now, on the flip side of that, all of those problems are also present, right? Nationalism as a whole is an issue, right? Chauvinism comes with that, you know, and you can see there's already attempts to make that happen. I mean, I think that the ACP, the American Communist Party, is a very grifty, astroturfed, all sorts of things. Maybe not every single member in there, but
No, every single member.
well, you know, I'm talking about people on the ground floor, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, if you're like, I need a party to join the ACP, that makes sense, I guess. It should.
I mean, I won't shame people for being grifted, but it's a fucking grift.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
You can do better, guys. But that's the thing, is that what they're espousing, at least, is for that kind of blend, right? An American national identity that is ultimately socialistic, right? That is based upon common work, common ideas, common ownership, you know? And I think that there is something there. It's really, really difficult to... I think it's difficult to strike the right balance, you know, and I don't know if it's a balance worth striking. I know that this puts me on the right of many communists because so many people just say, fucking obliterate America right now. And it's like, I totally understand that. I totally get that. But at the same time, if we're talking about organizing on principles that are ultimately massively popular, right, or understandable by the masses, American ideals are already part of that because it's the kind of thing that people think they are fighting for today.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I largely agree. I don't mean to frame the question in a sense to say that I think a nationalist position is necessary to organize because, like you said, there are ideals that are not necessarily a nationalist position, like freedom, democracy,
Yeah.
that are organizational ideals that people do and will fight for. But it's not a zero-sum game. We're not starting from nothing.
Right.
That's so embedded in the consciousness of what America is supposed to be. Is there an organizational benefit to framing it in a way like that, where it's like...
My gut says yes. Though.
Live up to the potential of what
Yeah.
America is promising to be.
And that's it, right? It's a question of like, what is easier to pitch? Starting from scratch or finishing something that's incomplete? Or maybe fixing something that's broken? I mean, I think that there is truly something to be said, like America stands for all of these things and not in their practice. Why can't we make the practice fit the message?
Yeah, we've experienced, even just in the limited scope that we exist on the internet, the kind of backlash around language that I think comes from this idea of American exceptional attitudes toward the Constitution, for example. You and I, and every principled communist listening to this show, knows that to say the dictatorship of the proletariat is the most democratic form of government that we're going to see enacted by a party, a state. But the word dictatorship throws people into a tizzy because they think that it's a non-democratic attitude or a non-democratic approach. Don't even get me started on them not knowing what the word proletariat means. But like that to me is evidence that, I don't know, as uncomfortable as it makes me, maybe there is something to organizing around a national identity that is like live up to what the Constitution claims to be in these cases. You know what I mean? Let's take out the 3/5 part. Yeah. Let's take out the indentured servitude through the carceral state part. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know. See, I'm in agreement.
I'm uncomfortable, but I do wonder. I do.
Yeah. It's possible. Like, that's the thing, is that it's possible. I don't know, man. I don't know. It's just such a gargantuan thing. Like, what, are we just going to abolish the United States?
I mean, yeah.
No, we aren't. It will break apart, sure.
Yeah.
But, like, that's where I'm at. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, like, I don't know, maybe this is putting the cart before the horse, like this conversation here.
Maybe.
But the problem is that it's kind of an essential thing in terms of organizing. You
Yeah,
know?
it's an organizational principle. So it can't be that, because it's part of what brings people together. I am pushing back on the thought in my own mind now, thinking about things like the Rainbow Coalition, though, and how you can find ways to organize around commonality. In that case, tends to be racial, ethnic organization, where then you build coalition across those groups, finding the common ground across those groups. So you get the benefit of both. Though that does call to mind this quote from Connolly. Where's it at? It's on 237. I'm having this thought in back and forth in my mind in real time. But
right. I think this is a great quote.
Yeah. He's talking about, I guess in this case, he's talking about the Kilkenny Confederation. But he says on 237, had it been all composed of the ancient septs, it would have crushed the English power and erected a really free Ireland. But as it was a hybrid composed of both, it had all the faults of both and the strengths of neither, and hence went down in disaster. So yeah, I'm going back and forth, like maybe this compromised position of like smaller groups that then build coalition is, we're going to get the benefit of neither and the faults of both.
Well, I don't know. I'm still thinking about that American ideal. Does Americanism carry with it all the evils of capitalism, or can it be separated? Most communists will tell you it cannot be separated. But I don't think that the average person... I don't know. I don't know.
I think I would agree with the, quote, most communists in this case. But I'm also thinking about, okay, if we're talking about organizing people today, working people today in the United States, to build some sort of coalition to stand against the capitalist imperialist situation we are in, that is going to require coalition with folks that most communists have probably written off. Ideologically written off, with some face-the-wall joke that they make to others.
Rip.
And like probably in their own lives literally written off. Their parents, their fucking racist uncles, or whatever it is, they just don't even interact with them any longer. Those people, at least some percentage of them, are going to have to be a part of this organization in order to see it be successful. What is the organizing principle that you and your racist uncle can agree on? It's probably something like that. Like the idea of not letting big government stand in the way, freedom, democracy, liberty. All the don't step on Sneck people, that is something around which you can organize that might bring them into coalition meaningfully.
So I guess the question there, though, is like, what's the more meaningful constituency, I guess, right? Like, I'm thinking about tailism, honestly. Is my coalition going to be all of the libertarians on the fringe, or is it going to be a bulk of people acting towards something and then those people come along? That's framed unfairly, I know, but I don't know. I'm just wondering, like, how important are those people really? You know what I mean? How many of those people will come along at the end of the day regardless?
I think that that's fair, and I'll take that point. But I would just also add, a lot of them have guns. A lot of them know how to use them.
Yeah.
They all dislike the idea of tyranny, even if they're not educated politically enough to recognize it in all of its forms.
Sure.
And that re-education will come with coalition, you know what I mean? I don't mean to make it seem like either of us have settled the question.
Right.
It will still be one of my questions at the end of this episode. Yeah. Is a national identity necessary for a revolutionary movement?
Yeah.
I'll just say it right now. That's my question.
There you go. I would expand on that too, because I think that there is a national identity that's involved. It's just a question of whether it's new. Because, like, we're talking about building a new nation ultimately. I mean, many communists, I'm sure, would say not one nation, but an international shebang. But if we're talking about organizing today, it's based on a nation. Yeah. It might be on an international ideal of nations, but we're still talking about a nation.
And again, I know that I carry a bias that makes me naturally uncomfortable with the idea of any sort of nationalism, but I recognize when it can be beneficial and useful for oppressed groups.
Sure.
That's why it's a problem in this context, because we are the oppressors, not the oppressed. But if indigenous peoples of the Americas had the numbers and decided to build coalition and rise up against the imperialist powers of the Americas around the idea of their indigeneity, I would be all for that.
Sure.
So there's something to wrestle with there. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
That does kind of facilitate a transition to something else that should be quicker.
Sure. Hit me.
I recently was introduced to a fella that has some pretty interesting perspectives. And he was saying some stuff about culture war in the United States. And I quipped, as all communists do, all war's class war, baby.
Yeah.
You know? And he was like, pushed back on that a lot. And he was like, you can't deny that there's a culture war happening in the United States. And I didn't know this guy well enough to really keep pushing. I was also in the middle of doing something else. And so I just moved on and kept going. But it got me thinking a lot about that. And Connolly has a quote that when I was going back through this text after having that conversation, I was like, oh, that's another one of those pretty prescient things.
Yeah.
He says on 200, back to this page, we're going to keep going
That's
back
a great
to
one,
this,
apparently, yeah.
near the bottom. Hence, the bourgeois press and politicians incessantly strive to inflame the working class mind to fever heat upon questions outside the range of their own class interests. War, religion, race, language, political reform, patriotism. And just to make it clear, I guess, I recognize that culture war is a thing, but it is a mechanism of class warfare. And this is related to that question around nationalism and coalition building around a national identity, because I think the things that separate us currently from that are these mechanisms of culture war that can and should be educated around to acknowledge as a means of class war.
It's something I've been thinking about recently, because I got my copy of Caliban and the Witch, which we should read.
Dope.
And I think that it's something that's been on my mind. I've been wary of class reductionism, as I've said before. The patriarchy and racism in particular are such large issues that it's hard for me to think of them as just symptoms of capitalism. And I think that there's some historical stuff to explore there. What I think currently, though, is that however it started, it is now wrapped together with capitalism, whether we like it or not. You know, and I think that that's really the key. You know, is that it's not that these things are just symptoms. They are their own problems, but it's like we're looking at what we can do to undo those things. It will have to deal with capitalism. That was a terrible sentence.
I have some thoughts.
Yeah, hit me with your thoughts.
It really comes down to a question of if that's a primary or a secondary contradiction.
Yeah.
And I do think that there are secondary contradictions like the patriarchy, like racism, that are large enough to merit organizing around.
Yeah.
To not let them being a, quote, secondary contradiction stop you from seizing the opportunity of organization around things like that, because they have very real world material impacts on people that are quite negative. And I think largely, to speak broadly, acknowledgement of one of those systems makes you much more able or willing to see all of the other systems. And so acknowledging the harmful effects of the patriarchy makes it much easier to see the harmful effects of racism, makes it much easier to see the harmful effects of classism then, right?
Yeah.
And so it leads us to the primary contradiction in theory. So, yeah, I think like there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that these culture war things exist and organizing around them, as long as you're also carrying in your mind that those are a means to achieve the goals of eradicating the primary contradiction.
Yeah, it's just the question of coalition again, right? As long as the socialist is in the lead, right? As long as the class conflict is what's leading that struggle, then it's acceptable coalition.
As long as we've built coalition with all of the other Marxists, right?
Right. So simple. Okay.
Okay, one other thing I would like to bring up. It's been on my mind a lot, but Connolly throughout this work references France quite a lot as an inspiration to what was happening in Ireland. And you can't read any Marx or Lenin without also seeing their references to the Paris Commune as being an inspiration to them. And in the context of, you know, the socialism in one country debate This was really interesting to me. It is quite evident that the people revolting in France, coming up in revolution, was an inspiration to the Irish. And the thought that I had, I'll read it directly from my post-it note. The French Revolution clearly inspired Connolly, and Paris clearly inspired Marx and Lenin. That revolution in one country can inspire others feels quite clear, and that international coalition could be formed in struggle for others once an individual revolution becomes established enough. Mm-hmm. And so, in the context of the socialism in one country argument, I think I'm sold on the idea that it doesn't fucking matter, because the idea is you see revolution happening somewhere, either in history or hopefully concurrent to your existence,
right?
And that inspires you to build a similar thing happening in your own country. If they can be successful, then they can build an international coalition that can hopefully encapsulate every remaining country.
Sure. I mean, I think it's totally prescient. I mean, even recently, right, the protests in Nepal
yeah,
that led to a change in the government also inspired other protests around the country, including in the Philippines, you know, and I saw a lot of really hopeful people saying the Philippines has a vanguard.
They do.
Yeah, the Philippines has a vanguard that could probably seize on that kind of moment.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think it's totally in line with what you're saying and what Connolly is saying there. It just takes someone to actually seize the damn opportunity. But the thing is that, like, nobody wants to be a martyr. But, like, you have to take that risk. You have to take the leap.
Huey P. Newton calls it revolutionary suicide.
Yeah, even George Jackson, when he's saying, like, I am a revolutionary, I am going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, it's just throughout all of this. Like I mentioned earlier, like the Chartist movement, but there's times where, even on 232, where you're looking, the thing that Connolly is saying there is that if the guy had actually done the damn deed, it could have happened. And that happens again and again throughout this. If they had taken the step, there is a likely possibility of it happening.
Yeah.
It goes back to that parallel we were seeing between him and Lenin, because he's saying, like, we have the organization, we have the structure, we have the means, we just need to put it into action. You know, we need to take advantage of these crises, and I think that that's also ultimately prescient. We have to be able to take advantage of crises when they arise. There are crises that are coming, and our lack of ability to take advantage of them is to our detriment.
Yeah.
It's almost foolish to say because it's so obvious. You have to have a structure that is able to take power, whatever that looks like. It has to be able to wield the power of the people because the people have the power. The people's power is coming up. It's going to be exposed at some point, right? The crisis will happen, and it'll show raw the sides of this equation. And I think that what Connolly is saying is that you have to be organized and you have to be ready.
Yeah, that's raising in my mind a question that I had around being a professional revolutionary.
Yeah.
Because Connolly effectively was, and if you're going to have a vanguard that's lying in wait like that, waiting on an opportunity to seize, that's effectively what they have to be. And my questions are around, how is that a sustainable thing? How do we make that a sustainable thing? Because, I mean, it wasn't for Connolly. That's why he came to the United States, is because he couldn't sustain a life for himself and his family. He was offered an opportunity to work here with the IWW.
Yeah.
And so he came here and he continued his revolutionary writing while he was doing organizing.
Dude.
While he was organizing here.
Yeah.
And that organization is what ultimately took him back to Ireland. Or took him to Ireland, because he fucking lived in Scotland before that.
Right. Yeah, his parents were literally famine refugees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's such a damn shame we're so against money, because money makes everything so much easier, man. Even when we're thinking about, like, what it takes to organize, you know, that's something that points so in favor of the trade unions, is that they have production at their behest. Right? Yeah. Other institutions, other organizations require funding of some sort. I mean, that's why all these trot organizations are still selling newspapers and shit. And it's because they have to generate some kind of money to keep their organization going.
Yeah.
To think about a professional revolutionary as well, if you have a party and if you're relying on dues, it means that all your members are working otherwise. You know what I mean? And that limits their time to do other things as well. I mean, it just changes everyone's schedules. Mm-hmm. So it's just a huge question in all of this. How do you keep something running? How do you keep something sustained? That's such a struggle.
Yeah.
That's a real challenge.
I mean, I was just thinking about that because in the Philippines, literally, they're living in the jungle. Like, they're in the midst of a guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, they have red zones in their bases of operations and shit, yeah.
Like, they're not fucking doing their 9 to 5 in the middle. Right. And then going to their party meeting in the evenings, you know what I mean? Like, they're fucking living it. That's how they're professional revolutionaries. I don't know.
The thing is, like, you know, you do that in the U.S. and you end up with Waco. You know what I mean? Ugh. Like, that's the thing.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. How do you keep yourself sustained? It requires you to have capital to invest in the beginning. That's the problem. That's been such a big issue for somebody like me, man, is that it's like, I just don't have the time to do this shit. You know, I don't have the money to invest. I don't have the time.
Yeah.
So it's like, I can volunteer, but it already makes me feel ineffectual.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked about my struggles with that on the show.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yet
Yeah.
another question before we get to the questions.
Right. I guess cavalcade?
In that case, let's jump to the cavalcade of quotes.
It's the cavalcade.
Well, I guess if we're going to go in order, my first one is on 211.
Okay.
After he's talking about the white boys.
Yeah, the white boys.
We didn't bring that up. But near the bottom, Lord Chesterfield declared that if the military had killed half as many landlords as they did white boys, they would have contributed more effectually to restore quiet. Love that.
Man. Yeah, on 227, here when they're talking about the volunteers, right? So just for some context, this is when the American Revolution was happening, and the Irish basically created volunteer armies for home defense, and they had demands as well, which I really appreciated. But it says here, in Dublin, there were 3 divisions, I'm on 227, in Dublin, there were 3 divisions of volunteers corresponding to 3 popular divisions of, quote, patriotic forces. The Liberty Corps from the working class, the Merchant Corps from the capitalists, and the lawyers from the legal fraternity. In plainer language, right, the government had to use force to seize the arms of the working men, but the capitalists gave theirs up secretly as a result of a private bargain, the terms of which we are not made acquainted with, and the lawyers took theirs through the streets of Dublin in a public parade to maintain prestige of the legal fraternity in the eyes of the credulous Dublin workers, and whilst their throats were still husky from publicly cheering the guns of the volunteers, privately handed those guns over to the enemies of the people.
Yep.
Just a telling historical example, right? The working men had to have their guns taken, the capitalists sold it, and the lawyers gave it up in secret.
That's so good. The working men fought, the capitalists sold out, the lawyers bluffed.
Yeah.
I want to jump back to 215, go backwards a couple of pages. There's this great line, back to what I had referenced about the fire in his rhetoric and how it reminds me so much of Lenin. I get that from this quote here. The human race has at all times shown a proneness to gloss over its basest actions with a multitude of specious pretenses, and to cover even its iniquities with the glamour of a false sentimentality. But we are not dealing with appearances, but realities. And in justice to ourselves, we must expose the flimsy sophistry which strives to impart to a sordid, self-seeking struggle the appearance of a patriotic movement. In opposition to the movements of the people, the patriot politicians and government alike were an undivided mass. They're not on your side, bro. They're united against you. It is up to us to stand and fight.
Yeah. I had marked even above that, just the section above that, where he's talking about perhaps Swift, Molyneux, and Lucas did not confess even to themselves that such was the basis of their political creed, right?
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, like, many people think they're doing what's best, right, for society. And I think that, once you realize that, it just makes you think of that quote, right? Never take malice for what could be ignorance. And it's just like, I have a hard time keeping that at heart and looking at the actions of people like Democrats,
Yeah.
It's just such a struggle to be in. Like, these people think they're doing the right thing, but you have to convince them and everyone around them to do something different. It's just so crazy making sometimes.
I mean, I don't even know that I think that they think they're doing the right thing, other than to say what they think is the right thing is to maintain the status quo of the
Sure.
ruling class,
Right.
I don't think they think they're doing right by denying genocide.
Well, that's the thing, is that I think that they do think they're doing right. That's the problem.
You've got more faith in them than I do, brother.
I think that they do. I mean, I really do. I think they've drunk the Kool-Aid, man.
I think there are some who exist in that party that do feel that way, but I do not. I feel pretty strongly that that's not the platform of the party, is to do right by the people.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't know. We spend so much time talking about like what capitalists do as if they're like some cabal, But like part of the whole thing we got from reading Capital was that so much of this action isn't. I mean, it's rational action, as in it's a result of them interpreting these things as something that they have to do. I don't know. I don't even know what I'm trying to get at here. It's just so tricky because how do you convince people? How do you convince people otherwise? Some people obviously aren't even worth convincing. Part of the message that goes throughout this book about class collaboration, time and time and time and time again throughout history, we see the middle classes throw the working class into the pit, basically, just to get ahead.
out.
How many times does it take? How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
Just one more election, bro. Please, trust me.
Just one more Big Tent organization will do the trick, dude. No, I don't know. It's a struggle. 241, they talk about Wolfe Tone a little bit. We hadn't mentioned him yet. Total badass. I mean,
yeah.
He was in the fucking 1700s talking about class war, essentially. I love on 241. Tone built up his hopes on a successful prosecution of class war, although those who pretend to imitate him today raise up their hands in holy horror at the mere mentions of the phrase.
Yeah.
Wolfe Tone, definitely a legend of Irish history that's been whitewashed in the current era. Same with James Connolly.
Yep.
Just like we were talking about MLK, all of those figures, when we read Lenin and he says that all of their revolutionary energies have been dissipated.
Yep.
Wolfe Tone is a great example of that as well. And it's clear from reading even his quotes in the Connolly that he was kicking ass.
Yeah, quite a badass.
Yeah,
I have one a few pages forward on 246. Connolly writes, a revolutionary party openly declaring their revolutionary sympathies, but limiting their first demand to a popular measure such as would enfranchise the masses upon whose support their ultimate success must rest. That just got me thinking about, it's a little past it now, but a few weeks ago, the discourse around the alt-left pipeline and the idea that perhaps there is a way to organize a mass of people around a palatable idea that helps pull them a little further left.
Well, I think that something on this page that really stood out to me just goes back to the idea of that maximalist demand. Even earlier, like when we were talking about the Democrats and the parallels to the Irish politicians, about how they said, like, don't expect real change, and thus the people shrank away from it. That's what Connolly is saying here is a secret to the success of their organizers. It is the secret of their political effectiveness of the socialists of our day. Nothing less would have succeeded in causing Protestant and Catholic masses to shake hands over the bloody chasm of religious hatreds. Nothing less will accomplish the same result in our day among the Irish workers. It must be related to the credit of the leaders of the United Irishmen that they have remained true to their principles, even when moderation might have secured a mitigation of their lot.
Yeah.
It's about being uncompromising.
Hold the line.
Yeah. We know what the damn goal is here, okay? It's like when people say the left starts at anti-capitalism. If you don't have anti-capitalism in mind, then, buddy, we're not talking the same conversation.
Yeah. I'd call it anti-imperialism, I guess.
No, sure.
Where the left begins, but
just the latest stage,
One and the same, yeah. Well, you brought up Wolfe Tone. I got to bring up William Thompson.
Of course.
256. We get some talk of this dude. It is told of him that he was 20 years a vegetarian and total abstainer. Look at this guy. My fucking XVX icon. No, I mean, a teetotaler, a vegetarian. I fucking love this guy.
No, he was definitely kicking ass. And I think that, the reason that Connolly brings him up is that he's an important precursor to Marx in the sense that he's considered utopian because he was in favor of establishing cooperatives along the lines of Robert Owens.
Yeah.
And what Connolly says is important is that he's the first to acknowledge that capitalists are part of the issue, that a world with capitalists on it is a diseased world, right? That's what he said. I love the quote on 252, a couple pages back actually, where Connolly says, for the most part, these theorists, the utopians, had no complaint to make against the beneficiaries of the social system of the day. Their complaint was against the results of the social system. Indeed, they, in most cases, believed that the governing and processing classes would themselves voluntarily renounce their privileges and property and initiate a new order once they were convinced of its advantages. Right? William Thompson said, fuck that.
Yeah.
The capitalists are part of this damn disease.
Yeah.
So that's why Connolly stresses about him so much. And, many other things, too. Part of that sectarian conflict, he also was a huge advocate for secular education.
The line on 257 that Connolly says obviously holds Thompson in very high regard because he says, he's talking about the comparison of Thompson and Marx. Mm-hmm. And he says that it's not fair to call them the same, but he says, rather, we should say that the relative position of this Irish genius and of Marx are best comparable to the historical relations of the pre-Darwinian evolutionists to Darwin.
Yeah.
Just carrying the torch,
Yeah.
The carrier of the mantle, so to speak.
Yeah. The class war is the factor in the evolution of society towards freedom.
Speaking of Marx, the other thing I would call attention to from these pages here is on 258. Connolly says, it is also curiously significant of the conquest of the Irish mind by English traditions that Irish nationalists should often be found fighting fiercely against socialism as a German idea. Although every social conception which we find in the flower of Marx, we can also find in the bud of Thompson. 23 years before the publication of the Communist Manifesto, 43 years before the issue of Das Kapital.
Yeah.
So the idea of socialism as a German idea, I like that he's nipping that in the bud.
Right.
and acknowledging that it is not confined to one country or continent.
Yeah, totally interesting to think about the kind of parallel development there. Sick as hell.
On 260, another thing where it was like, did Connolly write this in 2025? Hence, elections were a combination of farce and tragedy. A farce as far as a means of ascertaining the real wish of the electors was concerned, a tragedy wherever any of the tenants dared to vote against the nominee of the landlord.
Yeah, man, I'm just thinking about later on when they're talking about all the ways that they just couldn't seize the moment, man. They just couldn't seize the moment.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about on 283 and 284, they're talking about the Young Ireland Party. First off, Fintan Lalor does a little bit of guerrilla warfare advocation on 283 where he says, it meant the avoidance of all pitched battles with the English army and drawing it into a struggle along lines and on a plan of campaign where its discipline, training, and methods would be a hindrance rather than a help, and where no mobilization, battalion drilling, or technical knowledge of military science was required of the insurgent masses. He's talking a little bit about People's War there, but something that really struck me on 284 and then I guess also 285 is all the ways that the Young Ireland figureheads were idiots. Honestly, it reminded me about the Paris Commune on 284 when he says everything had to be done in a, quote, respectable manner, right?
Yeah.
English army on one side provided with guns, bands, and banners. Irish army on the other also provided with guns, bands, and banners. Serried ranks with glittering steel. Just crazy. It's not an even battle. That's what it reminds me of. We're fighting against this insane, huge army, this giant militaristic structure. It's crazy to think of it as an equal battle. And I love the idea of making legal insurrection that the young Irish leaders do later. All of these examples of people, the masses rise up and stop the prison carts, and they're like, do you want to be rescued?
Do you wish to be rescued?
The guy says, certainly not. Let me go be tried in court, man.
Yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous.
We have previously talked about crime in the context of socialism, and Connolly also mentions that. But he says that in the most crime-ridden country in Ireland, this partial experiment in socialism abolished crime, and then continues on 271 to say that it did this solely by virtue of the influence of the new social conception attendant upon the institution of common property, bringing a common interest to all. It really is that simple. I mean, it doesn't have to get that complex. Certainly, there will still be crimes of passion in any place where you have more than one person existing.
Yeah.
But they will, I think, also dramatically be lessened once the social relation has changed in a point where we are dependent upon community in a way that we relate to one another much differently.
Yeah.
As is evidenced here.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to look at historical examples of those kinds of cooperatives. I mean, even on the page previous, 269, that it's always the argument, right? No profit, no innovation. But he says here, to those who fear that the institution of common property will be inimical to progress and invention, it must be reassuring to learn that this community of, quote, ignorant, unquote, Irish peasants introduced to Ralaheen the first reaping machine used in Ireland and hailed it as a blessing at a time when the gentlemen farmers of England were still gravely debating the practicability of the invention.
Yeah.
So, I mean, fresh on the mind when we were just reading Capital, how technology is used not as a means of reducing labor or labor time, but instead of intensifying that labor time. When that technology is used cooperatively, invented and put into practice cooperatively, it is actually used to lighten their labor, right? I'm looking at the block code on 269 again. This machine of ours is one of the first machines ever given to the working classes to lighten their labor and at the same time increase their comforts. Now, if the working classes would cordially and peacefully unite to adopt our system, no power or party could prevent their success.
Yeah. Another top-of-mind connection is when we read Socialist Reconstruction and the talk about the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We can innovate these things and use them in a cooperative manner, and believe it or not, it will lead to different results than our current configuration. Totally.
Also, something that we didn't call out in our conversation that is just a fact that I wanted to bring up. He spends some pages talking about the potato famine, and on 286, he tells us, the state of Massachusetts hired an American ship of war, the Jamestown, loaded it with grain, and sent it to Ireland. The government placed the cargo in storage, claiming that putting it on the market would disturb trade.
Yeah. If the only knowledge you have of the Irish famine comes from what you remember in high school, I mean, I think this is a really good section to read. For one, I mean, he makes the case that it's totally by capitalist design. You know, all of the food was exported out of Ireland for sale on the English market. The potato famine only wiped out the main source of food because all of the other food was being sold. And That example you just read is so damning because the food could have been sent to people, but instead they were like, we can't put this on the market, it'll disrupt our market. Connolly even says on page 285, had socialist principles been applied to Ireland in those days, not one person need have died of hunger, and not 1 cent of charity need have been subscribed to leave a smirch upon the Irish name. But all except a few men had elevated landlord property and capitalist political economy to a fetish to be worshipped, and upon the altar of that fetish Ireland perished. At the lowest computation, 1,225,000 persons died of absolute hunger. All of these were sacrificed upon the altar of capitalist thought.
Yep.
Just damning stuff. Damning stuff.
And to close, just another one that really lifted my spirit. This comes right at the close of this work on page 308. Connolly writes, as the Irish septs of the past were accounted Irish or English according as they rejected or accepted the native or foreign social order, as they measured their oppression or freedom by their loss or recovery of the collective ownership of their lands, so the Irish toilers henceforward will base their fight for freedom not upon the winning or losing the right to talk in an Irish parliament, but upon their progress toward the mastery of those factories, workshops, and farms upon which a people's bread and liberties defend.
Yeah.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Yeah, exactly, man. Cheers.
Hell yeah. So this was Labor in Irish History by James Connolly.
Yeah. Besides the ones that we mentioned earlier, what questions did this leave you with?
I have no lingering questions. I already said them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same here. I mean, what is the national question in the current era? That's a question I've had for a while now. That's definitely one. How can we organize this damn thing, man? What's coming up in the world, man? Are we prepared for that shit? I know the answer is no. So I guess maybe that's not a full question of mine. But yeah, that's what I had to.
I guess one question that maybe facilitates a transition is what other work from Connolly should we read? I really thoroughly enjoyed this.
Mm-hmm.
And I have another marked in we have the James Connolly Reader. We're reading from the Haymarket edition of the James Connolly Reader. I'm really quite interested in reading Socialism Made Easy. Is that another good one to jump into?
Yeah.
Being totally green in the Connolly lore.
Nice. Very good. Yeah. Likewise, too, even outside of Connolly, if you have other Ireland-specific writings that you think would be helpful for this kind of discussion, maybe for our national question discussion, let us know. Along with any other thoughts, topics, other recommendations, suggestions, etc., at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
Please do. You should read this if... I have 2.
Okay. Go ahead. Do 1.
You should read this if you are curious about the development of Irish Marxist history.
Yeah. Yeah, you should read this if you don't have any knowledge of Ireland. If you want a nice picture of Irish history, I think this is a good one for that. He says it's not a full history, but man, it covers from 1649 to 1900, so you could do worse.
Yeah.
What was the other one you had?
You should read this if you are interested in an alternative to Soviet Marxism.
Yeah.
Being a contemporary of all of the Bolsheviks that you know, I think it's very interesting to see the parallel development with Connolly, and it's really fascinating, and to me, lends quite a lot of legitimacy to scientific socialism. Yeah, so you should read this if you would like to read about Marxism that isn't specifically Soviet.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. All right, so next we are going to read Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice by Rudolf Rocker.
Yes, I think when we compiled our anarchist primer, one of the pitfalls that we fell into was, even though we identified a lot of preeminent anarchist thinkers, the nature of putting all of their work together into a primer meant that we were really just getting very short essays from each writer, and I don't think that did them any favors in our reading. So I'm really interested to read more Rocker, and I think this seems like a good way to go.
Yeah. Out of all of the primer essays we read, I think that the Rocker was probably the most intriguing, and it's because it was the newest. Bookchin was newer, but I think the thing about the Rocker essay that appealed to me was that he had in mind the context of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
All of the earlier anarchists didn't have that perspective to put their ideas against. And so, full transparency, I've read the first chapter and a half of this, and I kind of already get an idea of how I'm going to feel about it.
Okay.
So here's my promise to you, Left Unread listener. This will be a 100% anarchism positive episode upcoming. I will not make a single joke. I won't bring up the Leninist conception of the state. I am reading this for the simple exploration of anarcho-syndicalist ideals. So
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this. I read the epilogue, oddly enough, which was really put it in an interesting context for me. So I'm looking forward to it. Make sure you grab your copy so you can read along with us.
Yeah. And don't get left unread.
Bye-bye.
See ya.